take the world apart, dissect it, observe it, and be in it and contemplate it. This is how you break through that cycle that we no longer have fear of the Lord. Just exhibit it and live in it and take it apart. Welcome to Machinae Ex Deo, the show where we're not interested in creating deities or all-powerful things out of the machine world. Here we're interested in creating technology that reflects the Logos, the machines of God. We're using philosophy, theology, and life experience to investigate how do we use technology to proper ends. Today we're talking NUMINOSITY, supernatural, mysterious, filled with a sense or presence of divinity, holy, appealing to higher emotions or the aesthetic sense. Technology, or at least modern technology developed out of the Industrial Revolution, tends to make the world seem less mystical. It disenchants it. It removes or obscures the mystery. We've got 5 of us on today, starting with...
Hi, everyone. My name's Jackson. I'm a cybersecurity engineer working in the defense industry.
Hello, my name is Nathaniel. I am a technical engineer and software engineer for medical devices or in the medical field.
My name's Adam. I work for the Catholic Church at a parish called St. Patrick's down in Nashua, just doing whatever I can to help our priest out down there.
I'm Thaddeus. I am a mechanical engineer. I do mostly design for R&D, kind of adjacent to medical and other weird things.
And I'm John, and I work in a warehouse, putting liquor on pallets so they can be shipped. Yeah.
Great service to society.
Truly is.
Really a big, broad brush of folks is what we're trying to gather here, and all the different life experiences, everywhere from people who are designing tech and really understand it to people who are, we use this slur of a word that is user, or more or less just users and kind of adjacent to it. And that's kind of the thing with the NUMINOSITY is we've kind of become almost alienated from the thing. And so that's what we really want to start with. And our opening question really is, how does this happen? How does it seem that technology demystifies the world? What are the actual mechanisms by which this tends to happen?
I think that probably a good starting place, because this is what I've thought a lot, is that on the one hand, technology definitely does subtract from the, esoteric, mystical, numinous nature of things, because, early humans had to be very, very keen observers of the sort of nuances of things, the behaviors of things, and the migration paths of animals, the interplay of the stars, the moon and the sun, the tides, all of those things, the changing of the seasons, all of those things, they had to be very keen observers of those things and the myriad nuances of those things for their survival. Technology has kind of removed us from that need. We don't really have to be super in tune with all these sort of shrewd and very, nuanced, discrepancies between things and such and their behaviors and all that. We don't really have to observe that for our survival. And so things are a lot less mystical, I think. On the other side of the coin, though, I've always said that science is magic.
There's actually a quote I love when you say that. I think it's Arthur C. Clarke, right? Mm-hmm. Sufficiently developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. It's either Arthur Clarke or Isaac Asimov. I'm not remembering which.
No, and that makes a lot of sense, though, because one of the things I was thinking is that it's the disparity between the input and the output of energy. So with a car, and part of the reason I feel like we call it an automobile is because the difference in the energy that you put into it, you just step on the gas pedal, and this thing that weighs exponentially more than you, or however much more than you, I don't know how much cars weigh, can go 75 miles an hour down the highway, when all you had to do was just put your foot on the gas pedal, or you flip a light switch and the whole room lights up. And for most of human experience, to get any light in a dark environment, you would have had to start a fire, which would have taken a lot more energy than just flipping a light switch. And so what it basically does is technology consolidates energy to such an extent that it's quite mysterious. You can't eliminate the mystery from it. In other words, I guess maybe what I'm saying is that the technological advancements of science, or that have come about due to science, undermine empiricism, because for the vast majority of human experience, that disparity of input versus output would have been unthinkable. It would have been, they didn't know that at all, and it would have been, they would have thought that that was absolutely ridiculous, that we could just simply put our foot on a pedal and we would make this thing go, 70 miles an hour down the highway. That would have been impossible to them. So I think that's kind of where the magic comes in, because what it begs the question is, what's the facilitator, right? So what is facilitating that? Where is the work being done and by what? And no matter what you could give me this detailed description of how the light works or how the car works, but that you would find that it would rest on top of myriad mysteries. So you're still not really answering the question. And you would basically, I think that's, so what we're talking about when we talk about magic, the most abstract denotations of magic are a facilitator of phenomena that is either unknown or unseen, which even if known or seen would still be vastly mysterious.
Yeah,
and that's God.
Like the phrase works like a charm. Yeah. Well, how does a charm work? Yeah. I don't know, it just does.
Yeah. It's like I always think about it with technologies like a car and whatnot. It's almost like, well, not almost. It is a culmination of our work to understand the world, and then taking a large portion of that knowledge and consolidating it into a thing that leverages the understanding on its own. It's kind of like, I think about it like a marble track, where it's like, okay, I have a marble. I need to get from point A to point B. Now, instead of me throwing the marble to point A to point B, let's say I build tracks that utilize gravity to move that ball where it needs to go. So it's I feel like it's like a culmination of understanding put forth of it's like a proof that we understand some concept about the world, and then using that for some tool, right. Or like the car example. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me, at least.
So the thing that comes to mind for me, especially with the magic comment, is that the end users on the project I'm currently working on say that all the stuff we built works auto-magically, because they don't know how it works. They don't want to know how it works, but when they click the button, they want it to work.
Oh, interesting.
For the input analogy, which I really like that John mentioned, computers, which is the kind of technology I'm most familiar with, are literally just input-output machines. It takes some input. Sometimes it's you. Sometimes it's something else. Does some fancy math, or not so fancy math, depending on what you're doing, and then provides some kind of output. And at least in my field, usually you're expected to interpret that output. But you also can put a number of applications on that, so the output of one process becomes the input for the next process.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when I was taking classes on computer science, that whole you have an input, something happens to said input to gain some sort of output, I think was in one of the classes I took, was a definition of a system.
Yep. A
system takes some input, does something with it, beneficial or not, and then you gain some sort of output that you utilize for something else. I'm saying that I also relate to that.
Yep, that's the general principle when you're trying to wrap your head around what's going on in all these black boxes we have everywhere. Because that's what they are to most people, is they're a black box.
Yeah.
No idea what's inside it or what's going on.
And the black box thing, where you also say that they don't want to know either. I think that's a huge part of it. When we talk about, because there's a difference between this thing is magical and this thing is numinous. Magical is I just do not understand how this thing works.
And couldn't understand how it works. Or something like that.
Yeah, it has really nothing to say about where the origin of the thing, where the origin of the the prime mover could still be earthly in a certain sense. There's been certain interpretations of kind of like, is God in the system, or is he outside of the system, or is he in just some like larger shell, or is he completely outside of this system? And so you can have magic that exists where it's just like a higher level. It's not outside of a system, but it's still wrapped into it. I don't remember exactly the
It
terms
still
for this.
follows the logic of the system, but it's not perceived by the system. Something like that?
Something like that. But needless to say, you can still acknowledge something as magic, but then does it actually entreat you to contemplate the divine? And in that sense, it's not really numinous. It doesn't actually invite you into contemplation of the higher things. If all it's doing is saying, there's this black box. It's too hard to understand. I don't even want to try and understand it, because I still kind of at the end of the day think that this is material. There's not actually anything spiritual going on with it. It's just way beyond my understanding. So it's effectively magic, but I don't want to engage with it like it's actually spiritual.
This reminds me very much of what we were talking about the other day, how in the past I had basically said that like epistemology is fragile, or that all there is probability. And then as we talked about it, I remember and I was saying that recently as I was thinking about it, a better way of putting it is that the only option you have is the one true worldview simply replaces contradictions with mysteries. But you can't get rid of mysteries. There's no... The materialist assertion, essentially, if not explicitly, then implicitly, is that we would be able to arrive at a worldview that has neither mysteries nor contradictions.
Correct.
But that's simply just not possible. So the best you can possibly get is replacing contradictions with mysteries.
The worldview of materialism effectively is, everything is within the same sort of plane of existence.
Exactly, yeah.
And this is something that you run into in computer science, actually. I'm going to kind of butcher this, and if people are familiar with the idea of the halting problem, there's this idea, maybe some of you have heard of this, maybe Jackson?
Describe a little bit, I might remember.
So this
I'm not
is
that much of a programmer.
I
might remember it.
Go.
So you have this machine that what it does is it takes blueprints of machines, runs them to find out, will this machine halt?
Oh, so where the stopping points are.
Just yes or no, will this program halt?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you then want to
It's
ask,
dynamic code analysis.
will my halting machine halt?
It's really interesting.
Or,
Yeah,
or if I have a
I see
there,
where this
there,
is
are, there are
going.
certain bits of there's all this is I believe the pure mathematical term is Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that with any formal system there's always some level at which it cannot describe itself. So if you are trying to contemplate the divine, but the only tools and words you have are in the system, you're going to fail.
Yep. It's
You
like when
have to actually break out. You have to go to some higher level thing. You have to actually embrace the numinous and mystical if you want to have any chance of grasping the whole reality of the material plane.
It's like basically trying to, in like the dictionary, explain the definition of a word by using the word. It's like that's not what
not
I'm
helpful.
looking for. Exactly,
Yeah.
It's not helpful.
Every word in the dictionary is described by words in the dictionary.
Exactly.
I
Yeah,
think I
no,
missed-
literally, no,
well,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I
There's a better
mean-
way of putting that, but
Yeah, but if you don't look at the definition of numinous and say, oh, it's something that's numinous, I still don't know what numinous is.
But even okay, you take all the words in the dictionary. That's still that's kind of a formal system in and of
Yep.
itself, right? The dictionary qua dictionary is incomplete because the words don't really have meaning. The dictionary needs to actually exist in the world where people speak English and where there are things like actual trees in order for the word tree to mean something. So the dictionary is not actually meaningful in and of itself. It's meaningful insofar as it is connected to a larger world outside of the dictionary.
And so far as you can encounter the things which are described in the dictionary.
Correct.
Right.
So I think you bring up an interesting point that the divine, the external, however we're to describe it, can't be adequately described by a thing of a lesser station than it, because all of the things of a lesser station are encompassed in the larger thing, but the larger thing supersedes all of the things below it. So you say you must then use something exterior to describe the thing outside of the lower station. But the second I actually do that and I create it, it becomes actualized in the lesser station. Therefore, it can't ever actually describe the thing of a higher station.
Yeah.
So it will always, and this is why the East always says it's a mystery. Not because it's undescribable, but because the second you describe it, you're wrong.
Yes.
Because it becomes less than what it actually is.
Yes. There's actually I really love this Buddhist phrase. It's the same idea. It's just much more succinct. That when a wise man points at the moon, the fool examines the finger.
Yep, I've heard that.
Interesting.
Because you can't actually go out and here's moon. You have to point to moon. And so you point with finger. And now, yes, you have the lower thing, which is finger.
So my question then becomes, we were using the word magic a lot. What was your definition of magic?
I had said that the most abstract denotations of magic are a facilitator of phenomena or a phenomenon that is unknown or unseen, which even if identified would still be vastly mysterious.
Okay.
Okay.
So why then would we not indicate that also as numinous? Because the numinosity would just be a higher level observation of magic. It is seemingly undescribable because it points to the divine who can't be described. Even if seen, which as Catholics we profess we do, we experience the divine and actually enter into the divine, but we could never describe it.
Yeah.
So technology then winds up being the same if I have the black box, which I say, I don't know what it is, I'll never understand what it is, I don't really care to understand what it is. Well, that would just be lukewarmness to the magic. But I can't know it, and it is something that supersedes my knowledge likely forever. Why would we not say it's numinous? Because I don't get into my car and then go, wow, this is magical. Even though I don't understand how everything works. I mean, I have a general mechanical understanding of how a car works, but I can't say that I fully understand everything that's happening, but I don't get into my car and say this is magic. Why not?
You should. No, I mean, honest. No, I've
Every
thought
time.
that before. We honestly, you know what? No, like Louis C.K. was talking about how he was like, honestly, every time you're on a plane, you should be like freaking out, and you should be. We should be freaking out when we're driving our cars. Like early humans had, and I mean, you go back even to like a time when like people were, I don't know, like even in like George Washington's time, people that were as poor, if you factor in, of course, the historical, the equivalent there, people who are like as poor today as they would have been at that time would never have had a car. Like they would have never had something that could go that fast. And so like, honestly, we should be like, when we're using our phones, we should be freaking out. Like this computer right here should freak me out because this is absolutely freaky. It is so, but we don't think about it in part because I think we've gotten used to it.
We've been numb to it almost.
And because again, it does consolidate work. And in consolidating work, what happens is that, apathy is bred. Yeah, it's sort of like familiarity breeds contempt, but also like when it does a certain quantity of the work for you, I'm not really inclined to investigate how this button translates into any number of things. And so, but that's exactly what I was, I think, trying to say earlier too, is that with technology, unless you really get into it and start examining it, you're not going to see the numinous. Once you start to do that, you actually do start to see the numinous in the technology.
I have a really good point bouncing off this. So I've had a number of years experience with music.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a really interesting, I wouldn't say argument, but or conflict. There is a dynamic in music known as the equal temperament system and the Pythagorean tuning system. Effectively, the way that music works is that whenever you hear any tone, It's not a single note, let's say. It is a mixture of notes at different volumes, and together it produces the full sound of a thing. Now, those notes that also they reverberate together in a sequence, they are the spacing between them is very like not easily defined. Like they'll be like, oh, this is like 12 and 3 or 2/17,
Right,
so whatever the
right.
weird fractions are between them. But when you hear them, they sound perfect. That's part of the creation, effectively. I'm going to butcher this, but I know in the not Baroque period, but somewhere in like early music times, there was a shift to change how notes were described. Typically, you would take those sequence of notes that vibrated together in sequence, and that would be like, oh, there's your 12 notes, or not 12 notes, but those are the notes that sound good together because they reverberate together. There was an issue with bands with tuning, because tuning to that pattern was very difficult, especially when you're using different instruments and whatnot. So there was a push to equalize or normalize the distance between these notes, the frequencies between these notes. It's called equal temperament. So instead of trying to match the frequencies that occur in nature, you instead produce them mathematically. So you say, oh, I have 12 notes. Cool. Well, I'm going to have each note, instead of it like increasingly going farther away or whatever the natural rhythm or sound would describe, it's going to be like, oh, frequency of this much is the next note, and then this much is the next note. It's literally equal distance between each note, which is easier for musicians to use, but it also makes music somewhat like a little bit flat or a little bit sharp. It's just a little bit off. It's almost like there's a compromise of, instead of delving into the beauty that is nature and music, there was like I don't want to deal with that. I want to have full control over a system so I can make it be used easier. I want to quantize it. I want to simplify it, when in reality it's not nearly that simple. It's beautiful. That system is now, at least in Western culture, it's used all over the place. And it's really interesting because when you hear Pythagorean tuning, what notes are supposed to be done as, it's beautiful. There's no vibrato. It's perfect, spot on, like unnaturally so, because we're not used to it.
Until you get to certain pain points.
Right. Granted, but there's, in just music in general, that's like one of those sacrificing beauty for simplicity or convenience, as opposed to delving into the mystery that is music.
Yeah, that actually reminds me. I haven't done formal study of music, but I have played it for a while when I was younger. And I remember one time at band practice, they brought in someone with like a guest conductor or whatever, and he came in and he brought some piece that is mostly just used for practice, and I forget which composer is one of the well-known ones, but I forget who it was, who originally wrote it, which was entirely eighth notes.
Oh.
So you sounds like you kind of might have seen this before. And at first we all tried to play it where all the eighth notes were the same because they're all written the same. But you have a little bit of leeway in how long you hold each note before it becomes a quarter note.
Right, exactly.
And then the guest conductor played it, and even though there was these tiny perceptible differences in how long each note was, it became less of this robotic, everything must be exactly the same, and sounded more like an actual song.
Right.
And that sounds like what you were saying with tuning is they went the mathematical kind of robotic route for ease of replication, as opposed to continuing on with, what naturally sounds good, because when we tried to play every eighth note being exactly an eighth note, it did not sound good to any of us.
Exactly. there is leeway there. It's the same reason why if you have a song, right, it's kind of like it's essentially creative license. If you have a song that you like to listen to, let's say I don't know, Entertainer or whatever song you like to listen to, you might still listen to the song twice played by two different bands, because they themselves will impart their own creativity, talent, and spin on the music, despite it being the same sheet music, let's say.
Right.
You have like syncopation and whatnot, and that's different genres use those to great effect. But yeah, it's interesting because nowadays a lot of people are using technology to either make that process easier, to kind of like shorten the workflow, so to speak. I mean, nowadays there's something called modular synthesis. I'm not going to get into it. Basically, it's a big computer. They can push buttons and turn knobs to certain settings, and then you hit go, and it can make beeps and boops that sound good at a randomized interval. So you basically are essentially programming a machine to make the music for you, as opposed to doing the music itself, which is really interesting.
That's almost like transhumanism.
Kind of.
Programming a machine to do the music for you rather than... that's kind of interesting. And I guess this is maybe a little bit off topic, but I remember thinking a while ago when I was thinking about, how so many occupations are kind of becoming like machines can do them. I was thinking that the one occupation, if any, that just simply cannot be done by machines is the arts. The arts cannot be done by machines. It's
I
not
wouldn't
possible.
be so sure about that.
Well, think about it. If
they can definitely...
there's some
Even-
some water in both, I think.
Even now, they already kind of are. The difference is,
Yes,
do
but
you
the
like
point
it,
is it
and
sucks.
can you tell the difference?
Is
You
it
can, and it sucks.
And
Was it
how long
purely
will that
visual?
last?
Like, I guess in like the whole relationship we talked about during transhumanism too, is there a difference between having a piece of art and it's good art because of its visual representation, or is it good art because the person who painted it intentions? What were they going through at the time? What idea were they trying to
because
So-
proportion is
convey?
just one half of it. The
Right,
other half
it's-
is
yeah.
quite literally the human character
bingo?
I-
it's
that
more
comes through,
holistic.
and machines can't do that.
That's
I
what I'm
think
getting
there's
at.
actually even the bigger thing, and it's not so much. It is more about relationship, and so what Jackson said a bit ago
right.
about how this is all about ease of replication.
oh yeah,
Oh,
I've talked
yeah.
with other engineers at my company, and we're kind of there's an agreement among some of us that we have overemphasized the speed and replicability of production.
Yes.
I gotta be honest, ease of replication is a very Orwellian sounding term.
Right.
It's creepy. Ease of
Yeah.
replication.
Yeah.
Like
You just want to be able to stamp it out no matter
it
what
just
it
reminds
is.
me of this sheepish populace.
So this is odd. This is relevant. I was reading a bit about basically how to set up Catholic Ventures, and I was talking with Nate right about this, and you said I wasn't going to bring this up, and this wasn't worthwhile. Okay, I got it. So, anyways, basically, one of the big things about reducing from the Acts of the Apostles, in this paper, he's talking about 5 different things, but the big thing is the Holy Spirit was in charge. Today, practically every Catholic initiative fostering a Catholic approach to work is looking for the answers by seeking out methods, procedures, processes, and applications of techniques. What has resulted is an approach that is not spirit-led, it's over-intellectualized. I would not go so far to say that we are not influenced by the Holy Spirit, but there's a key difference between St. Paul's approach and the very good approach demoted by some popular book. It's an excellent book, but there's a critical difference between what is promoted by the early church's approach and what this author presents. God is not fully in charge. God is only fully in charge when we consecrate and dedicate ourselves fully to God. When we actually, it's about the relationship. It's not only the fact that there's a human here, but it's a human that's in communion with God. It's a human that is actually connected to a thing that is outside of this system. It's the human that is pulling towards that higher thing. That's where the actual beauty comes in. And when you start to just replicate everything, you've taken basically a snapshot of what they've done and said, oh, this snapshot, that's the right thing. When the essence of the nature is the relationship that was there, and you cannot take a snapshot of that relationship.
It's interesting because when you're going through, in history at least, or actually anthropology is an excellent example, when you're trying to learn about civilizations that have passed or have very little to do about them. Like, for example, let's say Pompeii. Pompeii's a good example. Pompeii, none of the people that lived there, we can't talk to any of them for obvious reasons. But what we can do is we can dig up what the things they made, like the pots and whatnot, or the writings they had and whatnot. And we're not digging up to say, like, cool, those are words. that's an alphabet. We're digging them up to understand more about the people who made them through that thing. There's an
Those are some
inherent
incredibly
relationship in
lewd
that.
murals.
But there's an inherent relationship.
Pompeii was like a brothel town.
It was,
yes,
yeah,
I,
unfortunately.
I just didn't hear what you said.
No, you're right. Yeah.
Don't worry.
From what we know. But the main drive in that context is to learn more about the person behind the thing, not the thing itself.
So I'm going to dissent a little bit.
Please.
Yeah,
please.
When we look at machine learning, when we think about the replication of what we would consider beauty, when we look at, music that's created by computer programming or some form of art visually or audibly or otherwise that is created by a machine, if we, the viewer or perceiver, the receiver of this thing, understand its origin, then it must inherently have some sense of beauty because it's creative. But if I don't understand its origin, as if I think the computer made it, then I'll never find it beautiful because I think that a thing that can't be creative made a thing. I have to understand that the computer didn't create anything. A person who knew beauty represented the divine nature, created the thing, which then embodied that person and did something, whether it made music or art or otherwise.
That's a good point.
But I think the more important, you keep talking about it, is this ease. You had said familiarity breeds contempt as well.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I don't find things magical, the reason I don't get in my car and think that this is magical, the reason I don't look at the world and say, man, that tree is crazy. How could I possibly understand that creation? The reason I don't do these things is because it's easy for me not to. And this is an attack of the devil.
Exactly, yeah.
This is the enemy who has made you complacent.
And this reminds me of, there was a conversation we had a little while back, and I had said, because I was kind of thinking, what is the kind of sole cause or the main cause of the decline of religion in society? And you had said, I think you're absolutely right about this, easy living. And I think you're absolutely correct. It's kind of, like the classic, bad times make good men make good times make bad men, and bad men make bad times. And that's the cycle that we've been in. And but I think this is almost, in a sense, this is the essential question of Machinae Ex Deo, because then theoretically, what in a sense we're almost called to do is to take the good times and not make them bad times. But that's very difficult. And how do you do that? And that's kind of the question. How do we take this world we've been given with technology that does so much for us and not get sort of jaded by it, not get spoiled by it? And, how do we take the good times and continue to make good times?
Take it apart.
Yep.
So we make intentionally bad times.
No.
No.
I'm just trying to get like what
John.
you're saying. Like I don't know what you. Yeah.
When you look at the world and it's easy, you have good times. Don't rest on good times. Go out to your car and strip the dashboard out of it. Start dissecting everything around you and go over to that tree and take a leaf and stare intently at it and try to figure out the vein structure. How nutrients flow through this thing. What in the world is chlorophyll? How in the world does that take light and turn it into glucose? And just take it apart.
No,
this
but
is the theory of STEM. Get kids early on who are used to holding a cell phone to go make a thing that can make a phone call. Take your Arduino board, get a microphone, get a kid over there with a speaker and another Arduino board, get a wireless chip, and make a kid make a cell phone.
Yeah.
This will now inherently make us look at the object that we're so used to and we're so complacent about and go, no, this is literally magic. But we don't do that because it's easy not to. Why would I bother going through all this work if I could just get in my car, push a button, or turn a key and move and never think about it?
And that's so true, though, because that is so mysterious that these leaves, which are like receptors of light, and then you take the roots, which take in the water, and they mix these things, and it makes glucose, and this thing somehow lives.
Water, dirt,
and that's
and light.
Absolutely incredible. I mean, like, literally, again, empirically, without credit. Mm-hmm. Because from what we know, I mean, that is, I mean, in a sense, you almost see then in the tree the same disparity between input and output of energy that I talked about with the car. it's already there naturally. Things that shouldn't be alive are alive. You know, I mean, it's actually interesting because I remember when we were on that hike, we were talking about. I said it seems to me that the ultimate theological question is because we were talking about how like bees aren't supposed to be able to fly or something how like bees shouldn't be able to fly.
That's it's a little that phrasing is deliberately facetious to get people to or deliberately shocking to get people to be like, "Buddy, what do you mean they fly all the time? I saw it happen." Yeah. But the mathematical principles that are currently understood for humans to create flying machines are incapable of creating a bee that flies.
Yeah. Okay. I see what
in
you're saying.
the inverse, observing a bee in flight and trying to analyze how it produces enough lift to stay in flight creates some whatever mathematical equation that should not work because the wings are not large enough. The wings aren't shaped in such a way that create enough lift for the amount of force that's going on.
Yeah.
And I have seen where like scientists are recently, like in the last 10 years, like finding out bees don't flap their wings straight up and down. And that changes the entire equation.
But this is exactly what I was getting at though, because I think the ultimate theological question is theoretically nothing should exist, but it does. Like on all accounts, there shouldn't be anything that is here, but everything that's here is here.
The whole like Big Bang Theory, like, oh, it was chance. Like, well, and realistically, like you're saying, it shouldn't exist, yet it does.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
So I want to jump back. You're talking about take it apart. What this really says to me is actually contemplate the thing. That's really what it does come down to is if this indeed is, as we were, I think at one point kind of expressly said, you should actually think that this is magical, but you don't. Well, then that's almost your answer right there, is that you need to start doing things that actually allow you to make it magical. So one of the things that does come to mind, though, is, so take it apart is one thing, but there's that kind of makes sense for trees and things of the created world, because it's like, that's all you can really do. Okay, you can do a little bit of crossbreeding, and you can start to play with it that way. Actually, that's another thing. I think contemplation is ultimately playing with something in a certain way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Playing is one of the best ways to learn anything.
And so there is the tinkering aspect is also a way of contemplating with the thing, taking the bits and pieces and actually being able to.
When you were talking about that, an idea came to me of like, take it apart and put it back together.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you're getting the whole thing, you're analyzing, and then you're like reassembling. And that's like, I guess maybe the way to understand creation in some respects, at least. You can't understand it completely, but you dissect it, so you analyze it.
I am 100% in, especially taking both of these things together, the idea of playing with contemplation, the contemplatio. It involves, it's a necessity that you enter the thing. You can't contemplate an object from outside of it. You can meditate an object from outside of it. I can think about it, but I'll never experience it. Contemplatio must be experiential, so you have to have this. Now, we wind up with one potential downfall with, if we can put it back together, we now have the folly of pride. I conquered the thing.
So
That's
that it's
stupid.
almost,
Let me
and this
throw
is kind of going
away.
back to the beginning then, because then it's kind of like, even taking it apart isn't the right word. Analyzing is still not the right word, because like, you're not really taking it apart. You're taking it apart in such a way that you don't have to put it back together. You're just, but then it's all interesting. Because I'm thinking if you're taking it apart, you're getting into the fundamental pieces of it, and you're examining them, you're making sense of them, you're, again, giving a logos to, assigning a logos to. But then there's this kind of like, even that you can't understand. So you can't put it back together, at least not fully, but I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have drank so many Leidenkugels and I could actually think straight. I guess apparently.
For anyone who's listening, I do not recommend that you take apart your dashboard if you don't know how to put it back together. That would be unsafe to drive.
Well, okay, so two things there. One, we increasingly have gone towards building technology that is not serviceable.
100%.
Point.
You got hoods of cars underneath hoods of cars.
Yep.
and still you can't find the damn dipstick.
Yep.
We do not design things to be engaged with. We do not design consumer goods that you can actually contemplate and engage with. We actually try and
But
very
Fed,
much
how else
obscure
am I going to
them.
get million-dollar service contracts that may or may not actually get called on?
Yeah, what
Bingo.
about trade secrets? Yeah,
So there
yeah.
is a little bit that's a huge part of it. I think that's actually very much those cases where we are actively trying to deter people from entering into a relationship with created objects. That's an evil. If your only incentive for doing that is we think that it can improve our profit margins in some obscure way, and not like, okay, this is like 600 volts, you probably shouldn't be tampering with this. I can
Yeah.
start to hear arguments when we're talking about safety,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, I still don't want to hear them because. Look,
Yeah.
you put a sticker on it that says, this is 600 volts. Are you sure you want to open this?
It's
I'm
up
going to
to-
say yes because I want to understand what this thing is. I'm
Yeah.
going to go
I mean,
learn the proper
yeah.
precautions to deal with this. Thank you for the warning label.
Art flag.
But at the end of the
Right.
day, still, this is a created thing. We shouldn't have engineers as this priestly caste that kind of
Designing a thing so the user is physically incapable of changing it.
Yes.
I was joking about that when I was looking for a house and how if an engineer made a door open a certain way and you wanted to remodel your house, you'd have to get an entirely new threshold because it was like, oh, you want to open the door out? That's not allowed in this setup. Replace your entire front side of your house.
So I sort of agree, although I do also think that, I mean, to some extent, then realistically, designing a car that can both be operated and easily taken apart and reassembled obviously is at odds. You've got to strike at least a middle ground, if not favor the capacity for operation of the car.
Oh yeah.
Every-
and
So
then
there's a material reality.
there is, and that's why when I was talking about similar questions with coworkers, is we pointed out the in our opinion overemphasis of speed to market and replicability. So even something like something that was built in the 1940s, which still works, the mechanical rangefinders on the Iowa class battleships are more accurate at slinging 16-inch shells miles away than computer rangefinders, digital rangefinders, shooting guided missiles. Now, why is that? How could that be? There's so much less error in computers. Well, each mechanical rangefinder was built specifically for the ship that it's in. And each time a ship that size of a battleship was built, there's little things that are changed, little things that translating a blueprint to an actual engineered product, there's always a little bit of changes there. So you can't take one mechanical rangefinder out of the Missouri and put it in what are the other Iowa itself. The New Jersey is one of the other ones that are still around. You can't do that. But you could take the computer out of one destroyer that shoots missiles and put it in another destroyer that puts missiles, theoretically. It'd probably still be difficult, but you could do that. And they're built more quickly.
Having previously worked in the automotive field, we always used to say, if anything is advertised as universal fit, it universally fits nothing.
Yeah.
Everything becomes
Really?
garbage if it says that it is universal.
Interesting.
Because that means it's not been tailored to any one thing. It actually just winds up being loosely engineered so that it can kind of fit everything.
Can you give an example?
So anytime you have a threaded object that has a replacement, say it's a rubber gasketed replacement or anything else where it indicates that this could be a universal fit, it doesn't actually fit your thing. It just fits well enough that it'll work. Oftentimes drain plugs are this way, or a bolt that's
Oil filters?
non-pressure loaded. Yeah, anything that is a part that could be user replaced,
Yeah.
but it's not tailor
Not things
specific.
like nuts and bolts, which are actually
Correct.
strictly standardized.
Correct. Yeah, not anything that's actually pressure sensitive or torque to yield or anything like that. If you buy a universal fit head stud, then you're going to wind up with with big problems because that's not how that works.
Yeah.
But anything that taillights, dumb
Yeah.
plastic
yeah,
things.
yeah.
Oh yeah.
That it's universal fit. No,
They're really loose
It's going to
at the
be kind of
best.
close, and it's not actually going to fit anything because it wasn't designed to fit any one thing. It was designed to fit everything, but everything isn't the same. Everything is very different.
It's like if you're buying you're buying like an elastic belt. It's like one size fits all. It's like, okay, so for some people it's gonna be really tight because it's stretching, and for other people it's gonna be way too much fabric or whatever it is, and for maybe one or two people it's gonna be like, oh, this fits great. This is perfect. When it is serviceable, but it's not tailored to a specific thing.
Yeah.
I get that, yeah.
Absolutely. But I think even though we have non-user serviceable products being created intentionally, if our orientation as the end user was actually ordered, it should still be numinous. Because then even more so, I look at this thing and I say, I'm going to change my own oil on, an Audi QR5, whatever. You're going to take this performance model European vehicle and say, I'm going to change the oil. Okay, where do I start? Well, you got to get under the vehicle. You've got to remove 150 pounds worth of skid plate. And then you have to determine, is that an oil pan, a transmission pan? What's that thing over there? Why is there this wire hanging out from my wheel? Like, what is this? And you're not going to have a clue. And if you attempt it, you should be able to now contemplate it, enter the thing, and go, this is literally magical. How did they make this thing work?
So I was going to, one of the other things though too with my, when I was talking about how science is magic and I used the car as an example, one of the other things too is that if you're going to get into how a car operates, and if you continue to kind of chase the questions as to where the work is done and by what, you'll end up with something like ignition. But that's an extremely mysterious thing because with ignition, it comes down to a spark. And with a spark, even further than that, it comes down to the most concentrated interval of time, which is still, by many physicists, debated as to what that is. And again, no matter what sect of physicists is right, whatever their answer is, it's still mysterious. And that's part of what I was getting at, I think, with science is magic.
And you can talk to scientists on that, and then you can talk to actual engineers who do ignition and stuff. And they are not listening to scientists. They just know that I tweak this parameter, it tends to behave this way. You talked to the absolute most ridiculously smart people I know are engineers, guys who do internal combustion. They are insane. I hung around in our race car club and just listening to the engine guys. We had one who just posed a question. I don't remember what the heck it was. It was like the damnedest thing, and he would just like drill people on like what could cause this. And there's so many different explanations, but one is actually right. And it sounds crazy, but one is actually right. And
reminds me of learning
It's so
Greek.
difficult to get there from any sort of scientific understanding, but you start to engage with the craft and the contemplation and just taking in and being around that environment. It gets so much better. The same happens for me when I do a lot of mechanical design. It's very sometimes difficult for me to explain to someone. Like it's often difficult to explain like this is bad and this is why you should change this. It takes me a real good bit of time to actually sit back and translate that into words because it's just I've done this for so long. I understand like the stress flow around objects. I can just intuitively tell you here's why this is going to flow this certain way. And you kind of need to be initiated into that sort of guild to begin to understand
Interesting.
We have a certain stress at work where everything we do, especially if it's new, we're supposed to document it so that someone else who hasn't seen it before will be able to pull that document and, replicate what we did. And we constantly are getting, requests for more material to brief our trainers on, especially when things go wrong. But like, you can't really document how to troubleshoot. You can't put 5-10 years of experience working with a specific product into a couple pieces of paper for someone who's never seen it before and expect them to be able to handle the same level of operational capacity.
Because and this is I think this is where it all boils down to is so much of the world works on attitudes that are correctly oriented and correctly formed, rather than systems that are correctly structured.
Air quotes. He used air quotes.
I did use air quotes. I don't know that I necessarily needed to use the air quotes.
So this is I guess this might be sort of a change of subject, but I was also thinking about, and we're talking about technology and numinosity. I was also kind of thinking, and we're maybe sort of touching on this a little bit now, and I was thinking about electricity. And so my understanding is that electrons are called electrons because it appears as if they elect where they want to be. And this is why that term was used.
First I've heard of it.
And it's also interesting, though, because
Roll with
then
it.
it would and I might be wrong about this.
Is that actually...
I believe it.
Adam's
I have
looking
no
it
idea.
up, please.
Yeah.
I want to know. This isn't the most unreasonable.
I'll roll with it. I don't know.
The
It's not a
interesting
big deal to
thing
me.
is, though, the point still stands that electrons appear and reappear with it's sporadic. No,
They
real
don't have a
reason that we
fixed
can-
place.
Yes, we can't
Right,
really
right.
understand why.
If
Or
nothing else.
But then when I'm thinking of electricity, that would seem to me to imply, and I could be wrong, but it would seem to me to denote that those electrons are basically conducted. You know, they are somehow kind of prodded into operating in a certain way, moving in a certain direction. But that's still very interesting then, because then that's where you're ending up if you start to beg the questions as to how, I mean, any of these things, the microphones we're using and lights and all this stuff, you know, it comes down to an electron, which is a very mysterious thing in itself. And then how do you kind of almost channel that? Somehow we're able to kind of almost channel electrons, it would seem to me.
Yeah,
If
we're able to
that's-
take certain vibrations, put them on a copper wire, put them on a piece of magnetic material,
And why
put them in a
copper?
different piece of
Like-
magnetic material, and then replay it.
Yeah,
So
and
many
you can get
pieces.
into like specifically copper is very interesting to me. That it would be.
Are these actually copper wires? I'm not sure if these
I
are
don't know,
actually
probably.
copper.
I kid you not. This is why I
There's-
can like spend hours
Yeah.
by myself
There's
just
definitely
thinking about
Yeah,
stuff because
yeah.
the world is so beautiful. It's nuts.
But the
It's
wire
so
is a very
cool.
concentrated, thin. So that's probably why, because you're trying to conduct it.
Is
in
that
a
the ductile
specific-
property of metals?
Do you remember when we were first starting this podcast and you had the idea for the name for it being teaching rocks to think?
Oh yeah. That's the goal of artificial intelligence. You're trying to teach a rock to think.
Quite literally. Yeah.
And I'm phrasing it in a shocking manner, but it's a
Silicon,
computer,
copper,
silicon,
whatever.
copper,
It's-
gold, silver.
It's all
they're all
rocks.
metals and rocks coming out of the ground. There's nothing. That's all it is. Just put in a certain pattern, and then hit with electricity. That's all it is. It's a rock.
We're electrocuting them to the point where they'll begin to think.
Yeah.
We're basically building Frankenstein's monster out of rocks.
Out of
Yeah,
metals,
yep.
rocks and metals,
Yeah.
which are powered typically by one piece of magnetic metal spinning within a giant, really tight wire of yet another metal.
Computers rock. Sorry.
So I keep winding up laughing because it's kind of an observer effect. Like I am witnessing the idea move around the room, and I am seeing the creation of a numinous idea. This is consistently you're trying to contemplate why people don't contemplate the
Yeah.
world. And it is coming into actuality in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
And you had brought up too, you can't create the troubleshooting sheet because the person becomes the data source. The person, so you had at one point whatever the person is good at. If they're an engineer, they
When you say the person becomes which person are you referring to?
The
The-
person with experience.
Right,
The one
the
writing
person-
the documentation.
exactly,
Okay,
and in your
continue.
case, you or the engineer that you're like, this guy knows anything and everything about internal combustion.
Yep.
But he can't just transfer it. It's not easy because
Right.
it takes a life of lived experience. So you take a thing, in this case, the field of engineering, and in this case, this gentleman was an engineer of internal combustion engines or whatever it was that he does. Originally, the idea was numinous, internal combustion. We had no idea how this worked, and someone who had never seen an engine when the car was first produced or the horseless carriage, and we look at this thing and we go, I don't have a clue how this works. That is magical. It's numinous. So we went from that being numinous to now we're just used to it and it's whatever. I really don't care about it. I don't care to know about it.
Right.
I am just complacent of it. But then everyone looks at the guy now who's the expert, who knows everything about it, and now the guy becomes numinous. Because you look at this man and you go, how in the world could you know that was off time by an eighth of a degree and it caused a knock? And
Right.
how did you do this? He's like, because I live engines. Like, I contemplate the existence of internal combustion. And you have this shift of numinosity from the object to the person. And I think, though, it inherently means that human beings are becoming further and further distanced from one another.
And even from the subject matter.
Absolutely.
Yep.
We have become islands of our own creation. And I say, I don't care to engage the object. And because I don't care to engage the object, I don't care to get to know the person who made the object. In this case, also, we talked about the art that's made by machines.
Right.
I don't care to know the producer of the machine that made this art, because really I'm just not entertained by it. I am so over this creation that let's just move on. Let's get to something else.
Yeah,
I don't-
One thing I wanted to point out about the computers creating art is that any action a computer is taking an algorithm, utilizing an algorithm written by a person.
Yeah.
And the better the person understands what the computer is going to do with that algorithm, the better that person understands how
Right.
that output is created normally, the better they can write an algorithm that the computer will match or exceed
Yes.
the test output.
So this is where I do agree with you. And obviously it is true that anything that, if I go into a computer and I make a song, basically, I'm actually taking real recordings of real drums that were hit by real people. However, there is still something lost. It's not to say that it's not beautiful per se, but it's lost because it's now so many more steps removed from the most raw and natural. So you have
100%. Yeah.
I think the big issue is that one thing is I don't know that person, and it's not that there's anything wrong with that person, but again, I don't think any two human beings, when they hit a snare, hit the snare in the exact same way. The
They do with
personality
auto-tune.
is lost, and even if I start taking hits that's funny. I was going to say, even if I start taking hits from John Bonham, like, that sounds weird.
that does sound weird.
Even if I start, taking, programmed,
Bonham's Fight
sort of recordings of John Bonham hitting the drums, it's still not the same because also the other thing is capturing the environment it's in. And, I mean, like the Doors had an album where they recorded the whole thing where there was only one candle lit in the room. So it affects your mood. It affects how you play. So, and also when you're playing with other people, I mean, it all changes how you're playing. And so there is something that is still lost. It kind of touches a little bit, too, on how we were talking about food the other day. When things become manufactured like that, when there's so many steps removed from kind of their most natural, they do lose something, and
So
yeah,
that's the point where we're at now, but I'm not sure. I'm more inclined to think there's going to be a point where you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And even then,
Possibly.
a relatively old show now called Macross Plus actually had a scenario where the most popular musical quote-unquote artist was an artificial intelligence among
Interesting.
the human-controlled planets and colony ships. Because what it was doing, it would be playing music and interpreting like brainwave reactions from the crowd, and then altering the music to get the desired mental effect of, this is the best song I've ever heard. I feel so actualized by hearing this music. It's so incredibly beautiful.
The funny thing, though, is I think that if a thing like that were truly successful, it would become a super addictive drug. And then anything short of that,
You should
anything
watch
short of that,
Macross
it would,
Plus.
I think
Yeah.
we would be aware of its fakeness. So it's essentially an impossible standard to reach. So I
Maybe,
don't-
but
I think, too, when you talk about taking John Bonham's drum and then manipulating them and creating my own track, if it's true that it is inherent to the nature of creativity that you can perceive these different things, you would say it's lacking something. Did it actually lack something, or did it just give you something different? I could perceive, if you were keen enough, I could perceive that you produced this using Superior Drummer, which you can even quantize to rooms and EQ, everything, to crazy technology that we're using now. But you could perceivably know that I made this on my laptop. And then you could hear that in my music. You could perceive my creativity as an independent, that I am isolated in my music. No longer do I have the room with a single candle and 6 people in it. I only have me in my basement on Superior Drummer, and you could perceive that in my music. Whether or not the music sounds depressive or if it's, upbeat and dance music or whatever, you could, if this is inherent, perceive it.
Yes.
If someone were keen enough.
Yeah, I think you can perceive it subconsciously, and even in it being subconscious, it's still profoundly... and I think that's why it reflects in the sales of a lot of modern bands. In fact, not that long ago, I remember hearing that someone was saying that they had heard that it was something like bands are quite literally not selling as much in general on whether it was...
Music industry's dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Fun fact,
rough.
if you didn't know.
Yeah.
So I think that speaks, though, to the point of the contemplation. We have become pure consumers in society, where when I listen to The Doors, or when I was listening to The Who, or any of this British rock, my goal was to know the individuals who were producing the music, to see the album art, to go see them in show, to experience what they're experiencing, to understand why they, wrote what they wrote, why they played what they played. But I don't actually care about that anymore. I go on YouTube and I say, give me, early 2000s emo Hawthorne Heights. Like, this is what I want to hear. And I don't actually care about the artist of the song. I want to hear a thing that I just demanded. And it no longer becomes about the interpersonal. It no longer becomes contemplation of the art, but consumption of media. Because it's easy. And we keep going back to this idea of ease. The easier I make a thing, the less I actually engage.
I agree, because I think when it comes to who's your favorite artist and whatnot, at least for the people that I talk to, it's usually like, I have a favorite artist because the genre he plays is stuff that I like. Not necessarily like, his life story is incredible, or I can relate to him, the person. It's more like, he makes the set of sounds that I enjoy to consume, or something along those lines.
So one of the things that, and this was kind of the preparatory when we first had talked about numinosity, and I was like, you know what, Jonathan, I've literally never heard the word numinosity in my life. So I was like, I don't think I could be of any help to this. Looking at, and especially how you describe the numinous, and having the externality of a divine that I cannot. Truly, he is a mystery. I can't know him in the same way that he knows himself, because I am not him. And even though he divinizes me and makes me like him, I'm never going to be him. I can't be him by nature.
Right.
The scriptures tell us all about this because it's fear of the Lord. And we often, you'll probably hear me talk about fear of the Lord regularly, but most of the time in the world, we don't have an actual understanding of what fear of the Lord means. We think of it as being stricken with fright, that I am fleeing from a thing that I am afraid of. But that's not what fear of the Lord typically in the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, is talking about. They're actually talking about an awe that is so terrifying in the sense that I cannot comprehend this thing. And I, as a human being, think that I'm King Poopah, like I'm the guy that rules the world. I have dominion over all this. But then there's something that so supersedes me, and I can see him everywhere when I look at that tree. And I say, how could this possibly exist? This is the fear of the Lord that we talk about. Occasionally I'll, get home after a long day, and it's like, this was a tough day. And you think about all the things that you had done, and then you just stop for a moment and look up at the sky and just go, it's massive.
Yeah.
I am a speck of sand on the beach, and I think that my day was hard. But there are galaxies exploding right now, and I will never see them, and I can't see them. There's no way. This is what we talk about. We have lost that as a society. We do not perceive the world around us as numinous because we don't care to. We're too distracted so consistently by things that are within our day.
Yeah, no, definitely. But it's also interesting and I think that was something I was kind of thinking earlier too, is that if you look at every individual thing has 1,000,001 nuances to it. And those nuances kind of constitute the anima, the soul of the thing. It's the pneuma of the thing, the breath, the life of that thing. And this is kind of where we're hitting like Platonic forms kind of thing, or like my whole thing of like the sort of taking the archetypes and the forms and kind of melding them in a way, you know, the symbolic relations of things. But that's kind of what is like, that's the persona, the personality of the thing. And you look at like the stars and you start to examine how they work or how we understand them to work. And that's absolutely amazing. And that's kind of why they become symbols, because they have these things, these nuances that are peculiar to it. You know, like the deer has nuances that are peculiar to it. The bear has nuances that are peculiar to the bear. And things might share nuances, but they won't share the precise amalgam of nuances. And that's what makes the bear the bear. That's what makes the deer, what makes the stars and the moon the stars and the moon, and all of those things. But yeah, we're not really inclined to look at that. It's just so weird. I mean, that's kind of the whole question of like Machinae Ex Deo is like, we seem to, I mean, as humans, like our mission has been in terms of survival to make things easier. And that's what we've really gone so far in that endeavor to where it's going to make things really hard. And,
Ironically.
you know,
Yeah.
and it does make things very hard.
I have two things to say about one thing, because we talk about how it being easy makes it more difficult to see things as a numinous, is or kind of linking it back to our first ever podcast when we talked about work a lot. It's either whether it's intellectual or physical, the work to take something apart, the work to understand something, the work to simply think about how the heck, like, if I were to think about, hey, I want to build a car, and where do I start? Well, I need metal. Okay, so I have to figure out how to mine things.
Yep.
I have to figure out how to smelt ore. Thinking that through from start to finish, and actually figuring out where you start, because you can start like, oh, buy some parts. Like, well, where the parts come from.
Right.
Like, the more you start to see that web is, I think, whatever work that takes is where you start seeing the, not necessarily impossibility, but that numinosity of whatever system, whatever object you're trying to create.
So what's so, I think, fantastical about reality, and that's why over the years I've stopped, like I used to say, like if someone was thinking that something was absolutely preposterous, I would always be like, oh, they're living in a fantasy world. We live in a fantasy world, and it's real. And but I think what's so, and what you're kind of in part what you're getting at is, what's kind of so fantastical about this reality we live in is the fact that the Earth yields such materials, and that there is such a mode that you can configure those materials to where if you kind of just put your foot on a pedal, pretty lightly, relatively speaking, you can go 75 miles an hour down the highway. That is absolutely incredible. It's without credit, literally incredible. Not in the way we use incredible to just mean amazing. Like, it's literally without, and that's, I think, one of the other things I was going to say earlier when you talked about, like, fear of the Lord. And it's interesting, of course, how terrific in a more archaic sense would mean, awe-inspiring. It's so, because then that means there's this, anything that is truly, amazing is going to be terrifying. The relation of the fact that we have both terrifying, and terrific means that there's something truly, absolutely, of anything that is truly amazing, it's scary because of how amazing it is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it comes down to our true understanding of our nature, that we are not in control. So when I tend to think of a thing as amazing or terrifying or terrible, it's because it is completely devoid of my control. So we would often say, what's the most amazing moment of a parent's life? The birth of their child. Okay, well, I am totally not in control anymore. Like, there's a new human being here, and I don't know what to do. Like, if I pick it up wrong, I break its neck, and like, this isn't okay.
Yeah, and like, you literally made it. Like, what the frick?
Right.
You made that thing.
So you can describe, and I mean, there are fathers who will kind of tongue-in-cheek too, it was terrifying in that archaic sense, and also for the fact that they're like, a self-recognition of my weakness, that I couldn't possibly father a child.
Yeah, and then you're basically charged with having to not kill it for 18 years or longer.
Right.
It's like, how do I not kill it? How do I not
Longer.
inadvertently kill it? Like, how do I make sure this thing stays
Or
alive?
purposely.
I know I got to feed it. I have to look after it. Like, and it can do whatever. Like, it can eventually, it's going to get to a point where it can crawl and walk and put shit in its mouth that I can't see per se because I might be doing something. Like, that's pretty terrifying.
It's getting old enough to taste "Stop Following Me, Dad."
Yeah.
So I think one of the things too that you had talked about when we talk about creating a thing and you say, oh, well, I can go to the store and I can buy the parts. And then you say, where do the parts come from? If you could consistently follow that until its natural ends, you would become monastic. Because eventually you would get to the point
Yeah.
of raw material and you would go, how did iron ore get here? And what am I doing standing on this giant rock with a molten center flying through space,
Yep.
not crashing into things? Who am I?
So the chase after the source of etiology, causes and effects.
What was that word?
Etiology, etiological, having to do with causes and
okay.
effects.
Oh,
Causes
yes,
primarily, I
yes.
think. Yeah. It will kind of bring you through a series of steps, but it's sort of first, it takes you to this sort of alchemical step, the raw material, and then just awe. Like then you're just in this state of like of sheer rumination or just meditation or whatever the word is. Yeah.
Now imagine there comes a time when everything that has ever existed, everything around us, is belittled by one thing, one being, and you have to meet them face to face.
That is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, that's
That's the stuff of
terrifying.
nightmares.
Yeah.
That's
But-
the fear of the Lord.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's God. And it's going to happen to every one of us, whether you're a believer or not, as you're listening. This is what happens.
Yeah.
And there will be a moment where everything that we thought was big becomes literally infinitesimal.
It's so crazy to think about.
So one other thing that on why is the car not necessarily numinous is I was thinking about the truth of things. For example, the car deals with all physical truths, and if you were to ignore any of those in the building of the car, then it would either explode or simply not work. On the other hand, with computers, you can lie to them quite a bit, and they will continue to function in a way that it may not be perceptible to the user.
Oh, intriguing. Yes.
So if I'm looking for a specific type of variable or function in a code, I can say, oh, this other thing, which isn't that, but I name it that, and it becomes that. And that's on the level of code. That's on the level of applications. Like I've had to use DNS poisoning, which for those of you who don't know, when you type in the name of a website on your phone or on your computer, it's going to go to a server called the domain name server, which says, hey, this name is matched with this actual logical IP address, and then take you there. And you can lie to the domain name server. And it's you say, hey, I want to go to Amazon.com and buy something, but I actually took you to Amazon.Jackson, and you just gave me all of your money. And it will continue to function, and you will not notice.
Well, I guess in that case, do you define function as in, is it fulfilling its intended purpose versus...
It's taking you to where you told it to go when someone asks to go to Amazon.
Right, but the intent would change, right? Like if it wants to go to Amazon, right?
Right. But outside of the hostile intent there, I've used it in a way where, so basically we had a system which was looking for information that did exist on our domain controllers, but it was trying to go to a different domain controller to find it because it was the root, it was the parent of our system, which was not present or on or accessible anyway. So I lied to the computer and told it that the root was where the child was, and then said, sure, great, works, perfect, yay. But that's not where it was. Just to say that it had the information I wanted to look at just happened to be on that laptop, so I told it to go there.
So the only reason anything that you're saying is particularly interesting is because we assume that a particular machine has a particular end inherently. Because otherwise, if this machine is purely a function, it's a pure function. It takes input and gives output.
Right.
There's no such thing as a lie.
Okay, so you're saying
It's just the function just maps input to output. It doesn't, unless that function is.
But it does change. You can change the status of a thing by simply changing its name. You can change the capability of a thing by changing its name.
Well, you change the capability of the thing in the system you've entered into. Outside of that, you haven't changed it. Like in the world outside of the computer, you haven't changed the capability or nature of the thing by changing its
The thing
name.
being the computer.
The thing being the computer.
Because I've absolutely changed the function of the application.
But at some
regardless
point,
of-
it would have to translate into a real tangible thing, right? Or at least presumably.
No.
like well, I guess what I'm
X as a service.
I mean, the mechanical equivalent of this is I take the hose from my fuel pump and I hook it up to my coolant.
right.
Like,
More like you call your coolant fuel, and it becomes that.
It just allows for the thing to happen, though. It's still.
I mean,
No.
But I mean, that
it's
technically
it's
can't.
this.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, naming is how you hook things up and with computers. Though, that's
effectively.
it.
I mean, that's kind of like wiring things, yeah. It's kind
All right.
That's
maybe,
that's my.
That's a good
All right.
question, though. Honestly.
Yeah.
thing of
Maybe you guys
seeing
yeah.
that.
That's
I'm
just
not
something
sure.
I
I'm not
thought.
sure how this connects, though either. So
Well, because when understanding things that are true, I think is easier to get on a path to finding something as numinous than a thing where you can just change it at will and it becomes something different.
Right, but everything hinges on the perception of the end user. So in your example of Amazon.Jackson, I'm assuming when I go Amazon.com and you've changed my DNS, I type in Amazon.com, it actually takes me to Amazon.Jackson.
Yeah.
but it still looks like it's Amazon.com.
It actually, you did change the whole thing, but you didn't change Amazon.com. I'm assuming I went to Amazon.com, but I didn't.
No, I
So
changed,
I didn't-
changed the domain mapping.
Right. So
Right.
I, the end user, don't really care. I mean, aside from the fact that you just stole all my money.
You willingly gave me all
But
your
it perceivably didn't change to me.
money. Right.
The thing didn't change, you just rerouted, which is interesting because then you talk about if I can change things in the creative world, they become less numinous because they're less true. So, right? You're saying if I just have complete
So-
manipulative power, that's not true because I don't have complete manipulative power. I can't do that.
Right. And there's a lot more of that in computers than there is
Right.
on things that are
So-
are physical.
So is your point that it gives you the illusion that you have more mastery over the world than you do?
That might be a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, you can feel like changing the name, like a different definition of magic, right? When you change the name of a thing, you literally change what the thing is. It does connect more in coding in computer world than it would in a physical construction world, or even just contemplating nature, because nature's pretty awesome.
Because there's a huge temptation we always face in modern reality. It's like man has nature whacked. It's like we could, I mean,
The abolition.
I think we get to this less in the 2020. I think you go maybe back to 1990, and we definitely have a more stronger sense that like we control everything, and eventually we will dominate and completely
Subdue creation.
Thank you. Completely subdue it. Whereas now I think especially amongst very environmentalist types, start to run into no, there are actually fixed limitations with the world.
Right.
So I think, though, this speaks so much to our transhumanist conversation as well as also talking about the nature of work. These all tend to tie well together. Thank you, Thaddeus. This is a well-constructed and orchestrated endeavor. But when you talk about the idea of subduing the earth, that is literally your job. That is what you were told to do. However, we don't know what it means to subdue. We don't know what control is, and we like to think that my mastery of a thing is actually subduing it. But it's
Well,
actually
like an ideal master is a benevolent master.
correct.
So
Yes.
then
a servant leader.
Oh, yeah.
And you must be a steward. So
Right,
we have
right.
gotten to the point in the modern world where I think instead of being a servant leader and being a steward that I must control and manipulate all things. So when I look at the world, and especially machines, technology, I have gotten past the idea of being a steward and creating for the common good, and actually just self-manipulation so that I can have what I desire.
We have a very Nietzschean idea of mastery.
It's the whimsical what I say goes, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm remembering from the encyclical we had read before the first podcast, I forget the words used in that encyclical, but it's very much if you think of a ruler, right? Is a good ruler one who destroys that which he rules? No. You need to sustain that which you rules.
Yes.
So if you're looking at how you're, subduing, how you are mastering a certain part of your life or a certain whatever it ends up being, I don't know, I can't think of good examples right now, and you see it going towards destruction, well, then you're probably not as masterful as you think, because then you're not going to have, there's nothing over which to be a master if you end up destroying it.
I think by our modern standard in this world, there are lots of individuals, and in our society pushes the idea that I would rather be a master of none than a slave to one, and have this idea of I would rather blow up the earth if I could just control all of it, rather than freely give myself over to anyone who would have possession of me. So we've come into this completely singular idea, which is inherently broken. The human being was not created to be alone. He must have a fit partner. In this, also in the sense of all of creation, we are gregarious. We are meant to live in community. So when we look at the mastery of things around us, we should have always the aim of community in the sense of free gift. So even if it is forestry, other past profession, I don't go out into the woods and demand from the woods something to be done. I go into the woods engaging the world around me and then saying, I do have a need. I must steward this land so that a need can be provided for and also a common good achieved, because I'm not the only one here.
Right.
And we saw in society, especially the age of the railroad tycoons, just go and strip the land. Who cares? I need the wood, and the land is fruitless. I don't really care about it.
Right.
Yeah, and then the world lights on fire, and your railroads are destroyed, and the entire world is in upheaval. Well, you've just become a master of none, because everything has just fallen apart.
Yep.
Right.
But this is what society feeds us so constantly. And we've lost the sense of numinosity and fear of the Lord, because I would rather everything burn and me stand on top of an ash heap than I would to stop and say, I can't control any of this.
So mastery.
Yes. Mastery. Don't kill the thing you're mastering, because probably you screwed up.
Well, I think, honestly, if you kill the thing that you're mastering, you've killed your love.
Yeah.
That's effectively what it really does come down to. When you find someone who has mastered something, they have gone and they have had a intimate relationship. They know the thing.
Right.
They have gone through so much effort to actually get to the point where they know it inside and out. They have their attitudes adjusted. And you see this especially with the skilled trades. Like a farmer is a farmer through and through. A carpenter is a carpenter through and through. They always bring the same mindset. They're to any situation. You do not cease being that. So like I come from a farm background, and granted it's a modern farm background, so I'm constantly thinking about a little bit of process efficiency. I'm thinking about making sure that machines are reparable. I'm thinking about what am I going to need to do here. But that you just don't shake it off. And it's even more so the case with my dad. He's just always on.
Even not with skilled trades, like somebody who's been living in their home for 10, 20 years, it's not just a physical object to them at that point. Like their entire life is tied up in that thing. Yeah, they're like you said, that if you spend enough time working on something, caring for something, you're going to, that's like the physical action of loving that thing. Right? You don't just get separated from that and say, oh, it's, just a couple acres of the farm that lit on fire. Oh, it's just my thresher machine that is broken for the next 2 weeks.
Oh, that's just my server rack that's gone down. Like this extends into all the high tech as well.
Oh yeah, when people say, "Oh, XYZ is my baby,"
they mean
they mean it. They're probably the one who did all of the stressful labor getting that to work right.
Reminds me of like
naturally they don't work right.
It reminds me of like in seafaring, and they would commonly refer to their ship endearingly because, in all honesty, they would work as like a labor of love to keep that ship operable, and that was kind of like the whole like it's my baby, basically same idea.
Your baby and your home when it's a ship.
Is that ordered towards appropriate mastery?
Is what ordered?
The desire to refer to the thing as my baby, the labor of love, the idea that this thing is somehow integrated into who I am. It's part of my identity.
I'm hesitant on this because I feel like the paternal and maternal instincts should be reserved for child rearing. This is an interesting rabbit hole because I feel like this goes into anything like you see some cartoon character and be like, oh, that's cool, when the character isn't a real thing. It's just an idea. A lot of like Pixar movies, let's say, and stuff like that have that try to get that emotion from viewers for various different reasons in storytelling and whatnot. But my gut reaction is that should be reserved for child rearing, because if you're reserving those emotions and whatnot for something that isn't alive, I don't know, it doesn't mesh right in my head. I can't really pin down why.
Yeah, so I always have seen that as an analogy, not literally I am trying to raise this thing, because I'm usually deals with servers and whatnot. They don't grow, right? You can't do that.
This is not my blood.
Physical stuff, but
I do know a lot of people who.
But is it rightly ordered mastery? It definitely can be in a situation where it's not rightly ordered mastery. So if I set up a PKI backend and then someone touches it and breaks it, and I go, why did you touch my PKI system? Well, it's not my PKI system, literally, but I'm the one who built it. I'm the one who got it working. There's all this work that I've put into it, and someone else broke it. And at least with work, right, with my job, with a person's job, that kind of don't touch it because it's mine is not rightly ordered mastery, because there is a certain distance which you need to be able to function in that kind of corporate environment where we're going to be shipping it overseas in 3 months. And that's why I also think it's the phrase "it's my baby" is very much an analogy.
And it does actually even go all the way to the point of conception.
Yeah.
Because if you're in a concept design environment like I am, you have to immediately have detachment from whatever thing you're ideating.
Yep.
Otherwise, you're going to get stuck with this terrible idea. That's not going to work out very well. So you can take it too far to the point of being insanely attached. There's a certain point at which you have to recognize, this is sub-creation. I could have this wrong. There's nothing particularly. I'm not building a sacred cow, so to speak.
Right. But even if you have that distance, that doesn't mean that you're not engaging lovingly with that creation.
Correct.
And that you don't feel discomfort when something does go wrong with it, when it does get broken.
Even beyond that, I think Like we've been talking about this as like if you're the one bringing the thing to fruition or like conceptualizing the thing and whatnot. What I thought, and this might be just me misunderstanding the question, but it's kind of like in line with what we're talking about. When you ask that question about are those instincts rightly ordered for this? What I thought is like, maybe just me just in computer science for so long, thinking about like robots that try to come across as human or more relatable and whatnot. And when you
seen
have
those videos of those latest robots with like the synthetic face,
oh yeah, it's real weird, really uncanny valley stuff
Uncanny
there.
Valley, 100%.
Yeah, it's weird.
It's
But,
really
like,
creepy.
It's the idea of like they're trying to make the thing more approachable, but in turn many people want to dedicate those instincts to an object, not a person that has a soul and whatnot. And I am not a fan of that. I like a clear cut line of this is what's real and this is a thing. This is a rock. If it gets destroyed, oh well. I'm not going to be super tied to it. So like it's really funny because I'm compared to a lot of the other people in my family and friends or some of my friends at least. I am much more stout on that point because me working in that field is like I need to make this line here and keep that at the forefront because so many other people aren't making that line or blurring that boundary a little bit. So for me, I do not think that is correctly ordered.
I agree.
Okay.
Now, having said that, I think that your point to bring up the humanization of machine inherently speaks that society, even if in this room we have a group of men who do not wish to humanize their creation. I don't actually view the computer program as a child. I don't view the timber that I made as this labor of love that requires my heart and soul. You don't view, anything else that we do as having human quality. The rest of the world does. And the rest of the world is pushing this idea to the point now where in our society we have talked about what right does that machine have, that humanoid that I've created, which incorporates artificial intelligence, and I can say is actually intelligent. We can argue that in a different podcast.
Sure.
Yeah.
We try to give them rights because now it becomes an idea of actual dominion that I created a thing that now is so important. My creation is so important that I must now say that I am its master. I must create it, give it rights, say that this thing is actually human. I'm giving it human qualities. So I think the rest of the world, with this idea of mastery, has gotten so far out of whack because we're not numinous any longer. We don't look externally, but we look internally. We become creative. We become the master of our trade to the point where we say, this is my trade. I just planted the flag on this. This robot with a fleshy, gross-looking face. This is my robot.
Okay. Yes. This goes back a little bit to what I was talking about, priestly castes.
Yeah.
And engineers very much can start to say, maybe not this is mine.
They definitely want to be that cast.
But at least want to be like, this is ours. In the most unhealthy fashion that a guild is. Of like, this is ours, and it's explicitly not yours. Do not peek behind the curtain. Do not pull the curtain behind. Do not look at the man behind the curtain.
Do not ask why we are doing the things that we do.
Yes.
And I think inherently, too, it must be the pride comes in the sense that I made it, or we, in the collective of a guild, we made it.
We made it such that it has all of the observable physical behaviors of a human. Therefore, it must be legally equivalent to a human because that's the farthest extent that we can conceive what a human is.
So
in the extreme case, but even in milder cases, simply, we made this so it meets all of the user requirements. You don't need to touch it. You don't need to open it up. You do not need to contemplate this.
Yep.
So I think, too, that speaks to, I'm assuming it was in transhumanism we talked about this, Shem. They wanted to make a name. So there is this idea that I can make a name without any exterior influence. I don't need God to name myself. I am going to make a name, and I'm going to build myself a tower, and I'm going to get to heaven, and I'm going to conquer everything. I'm going to Shem. So this is the same thing that we're talking about in the sense of our desire to subdue and to create and to master our craft, that I am going to make a name for myself. I don't need anything else. I don't need to view the exterior world. I don't need to look at the fear of the Lord. I don't need to look into the stars and say, why am I creating? How am I creating? How could this existence even be? I actually just want to make a name for myself. And I want to make this thing, and I want to be its master, and I want to have dominion, but without any of the externality. I want it to be this tiny little microcosm of this is my world, and I created it, and it's disordered inherently. I think we can look to the nature of our fallen state to say we desire no longer to be created, but to be creator. And we have, because we have lost this sense of numinosity, that we no longer view the external as external. We no longer look to the divine as being outside, and we somehow partake in his goodness, and we can view his creation as absolutely undeserved, but we actually say that this is mine. I can do with it whatever I want, and I can actually create things without any other input. So now, how do we fix it in society?
Well, that's the thing, because I feel like the answer to this is in certain attitudes and mindsets in engaging creation and what we create. Because if we're created in God's image, and God didn't need to create anything, but did, then why would not humans also have a need to create something, right?
Life. You have the creative power that the Father gave you. Yeah. Now, granted, we have all sorts of other things that we can do to make life easier, which has then led to the good times, which led to weak men, and weak men led to bad times. Mm-hmm. But we have to now constantly, my argument would be the best way, and you say in lived behavior, to show this to the world, you need to just go out into the world and stop in the middle of the street and just observe. Mm-hmm. Look at the stoplight. This thing is stupid. We created this thing. A light changes colors. People observe it. The world changes. Literally, people stop moving because of this little technology that then you start dissecting it down to its smallest parts, and you say, okay, there's a colored lens, and in that colored lens is a light, and in that light is a filament or an LED, a diode of some sort, something that emits visible light. How do my eyes even work? And then you sit there and you fall into this monasticism of, how did this moment right now, how does this occur? And then somebody who's passing by, especially if it's someone you know, someone who you work with, maybe someone not of the faith, just sees you observing and goes, what are you doing? And you can just kind of sit with that for a moment. The more we do this in the world, and the more that we have the awe, the fear of the Lord, the more people recognize that, oh, maybe I've been totally unobservant my entire life. Maybe there actually is something more important than my creation, than this stupid widget that I planted my flag on and said it's mine. I'm the creator.
You've pillaged it. You've colonized it. I was listening to a podcast who really used colonization as the antithesis of monasticism, and I was just like, that's such a great dichotomy. And you're right. That is how you break the cycle of once you get to the good times. Instead of continuing and trying to keep conquering things and pushing forwards until there's nothing more to push forwards into, and you eventually go off a cliff, you sit back and you contemplate. You actually start to just grapple and engage with the thing. And I think in certain cases also that gives you the added benefit of eventually you contemplate it for long enough and you say, oh, this is busted. This is actually harmful. Upon enough contemplation, we need to do something about this. Actually sitting back and asking those contemplative questions, not only just simple, pure contemplation of how and what is the actual thing of this, but contemplation of how does this interplay with the rest of reality. And that's, I think, how you start to break the cycle.
See, I don't think the answer is everyone becomes a contemplative.
Not a complete contemplative.
Because like the act of, for one thing, there's a lot of truth in learn by doing. So just looking and observing a stoplight, sure, that's cool, but might you not learn more by building and creating a stoplight? And then you get into the sense of, well, there are certain, you don't, the attitude that I was thinking of is you don't need to create something and say, this is mine, this has equal value to something that it doesn't. It has more value than someone else's creation because it is mine. But you can create something that you intend to use to help your community in some way. And if it fulfills its purpose, great. You've helped your community. And that extra level of pride, where we have seen that there are disorders in the whole robotics thing, doesn't need to come into it, even if it's a temptation when you get to certain levels of creation that are not understood by the vast majority of people.
I would not indicate that every person is to be a contemplative solely.
Yes.
Every person must be contemplative. Otherwise, we will be narrow-sighted and we will look down at our feet instead of looking up into the heavens. We have to, even if I'm a creator and I say I desire creation for the benefit of mankind, I must also contemplate mankind. I must contemplate the world around me. I must experience these things. The best creators of all history looked up into the stars and said, how could this exist? And then they started to replicate the nature around them. The only reason we created half of the things, look at Da Vinci, creating things that we couldn't even possibly fathom at the time of his inception of the idea, it's because he was constantly in awe of everything around him. And we can look to a lot of the great creators of our time. So do both and be the creator.
That's kind of what I was getting at. I was
Yes.
hearing all this, just stop and think about things. And it's like, I don't really see like you mentioned Da Vinci creating a almost tank and a helicopter that would work if humans could incessantly put out power. Right? Like,
If you just had an engine.
Yeah.
Literally,
Imagine.
Yeah.
To think of creating
Like
an
seeing-
object that could fly with another object that hasn't even been created
I
yet.
didn't want to end on a note where we're like, oh yeah, don't make things ever. Just contemplate, and then you'll make a baby if you get married. Yeah. Because that's
Everyone be a vegetable. Just stare into the sun until the world
That's how we
explodes.
fix things. No, that's fatalism.
No,
That's not what we
that's
do.
what
There's
a
more
little
to
bit
it,
of what
yeah.
I was getting is I didn't want to end that there.
No, but
Clarification, yeah.
in the argument too from earlier in the podcast, how do we then have the awe, the fear of the Lord?
Especially when what a person can create was deemed impossible even 5 years ago. That you should feel a little bit good about yourself for being able to do that, but the temptation for the pride we've discussed is extremely strong the further along you get.
But to reinstill the fear, take it apart. We talked about this is contemplation, to actually experience a thing and to live with it and dwell with it, to be in it. And even if I can't put it back together, or if I could, wonderful. I hope that I can put my car back together after I take it apart because I rely on that thing.
Yep.
But take the world apart, dissect it, observe it, and be in it and contemplate it. This is how you break through that cycle that we no longer have fear of the Lord. Just exhibit it and live in it and take it apart.